अनीता बोस फाफ, जो कि बेटी है नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस की, वो हमारे साथ सीधा जुड़ रही हैं। लेकिन अपने दर्शकों को ये बता दें कि चूंकि वो हिंदी नहीं समझती हैं, मैं अंग्रेजी में ही उनसे बातचीत कर पाऊंगी। 2-3 सवाल उनके जरिए ये समझने की कोशिश कि आज जब हिंदुस्तान इतना बड़ा जश्न नेताजी के नाम पर मना रहा है, उनके मन में क्या बातें आ रही हैं। A very warm welcome to you, Anita ji. My first question to you would be, the Prime Minister of India has actually celebrated Netaji's Jayanti in a massive and very enormous manner in Kolkata. You must be seeing the visuals that are coming across. How would you like to remember Netaji today, and what are your feelings on how it's being celebrated in India?
Well, namaskar and Jai Hind to all of you. I'm very happy that Netaji is being honored today on his 124th birth anniversary by people across India, and of course I also feel honored that the Prime Minister himself came to Kolkata to honor him. I think it is very gratifying for my father that after so many years, people do remember him, to love him, and to admire him. And I think he has given a lot for his country, but if he were to know that this happened, I think he would feel very gratified.
Anita, do you have a feeling where a lot of people within India feel that he was not given his due place in India's history? The kind of freedom struggle that he led for India, the way he challenged the Britishers, the way he led a whole army in foreign land, and he tried to combat the Britishers. Do you feel that he has not been given his due place in India's history?
To some extent that is certainly true, but that also was caused by the fact that in the beginning, the beginning years of after independence, many of the documents were not yet available, and for example later on when they became declassified, it turned out that his contribution and the contribution of the INA played a very important part to lead to the uprising of the Indian armed forces, which eventually caused the premature
withdrawal?
Well, as the British called it, transfer of power. But I mean, India became independent in 1947, whereas the original date had been later. And it also, and the Redford trials of 3 Indian INA officers, Prem Saigal, Colonel Shahnawaz Khan and Colonel Dhillon, I think also publicized the contribution of the INA to India's independence in India.
Yeah. My last question to you would be that within the political circles in India, and because West Bengal is due for elections, there is a lot of hue and cry about how each party is trying to appropriate Netaji's legacy. What would you say on that? There's a huge fight between the BJP and the TMC, each criticizing the other for politicizing his legacy. What would you say?
Well, evidently both parties are politicizing his legacy. I'm quite convinced that, say, for example, the Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, is a true admirer of Netaji and always has been. And I presume Prime Minister Narendra Modi is too. Yeah. So I think it's quite legitimate that they claim him in some way. But on the other hand, I mean, just before an oncoming election, you have to expect that parties sort of compete and try to politicize all their activities. This is not entirely illegitimate. It would be preferable if they could sort of get together, honoring him and celebrating him. But I think maybe that's asking too much of a political party in these days. And I think that it's better there is a competition how to honor him than not to honor him at all.
Wow, that's an interesting take. My last question to you would be, we all revere and we all worship this great freedom fighter. The whole country joins today in celebrating his birth. How would you express the exact feelings that you have as the daughter of the legend, the great freedom fighter, Subhash Chandra Bose?
I'm very grateful to his country, and on the other hand, I think he also deserves this honor because he has sacrificed a lot for his country. That the love for his country was the all-encompassing sentiment that he had, and I think everything else had to take second place. All the loyalties to family, friends, and so on were superseded by this loyalty and love for his country. So I think in a way he deserves the love of his country, and it is wonderful that it is still given after so many years.
Anitaji, we're getting amazing responses. There are people from social media sending us many questions because they're actually very amazed to see you today and hear you in India. I think we should continue with the conversation if you have time. Because see, Netaji, it was always alleged, because you started by saying, you say that you find this entire fight over his legacy legitimate and right because it's to honor him, which is great. But on the other hand, it has always been alleged that the Congress party, the BJP, accuses the Congress party of not letting Netaji get the kind of limelight that he should have. Has this been a part of your growing up years? Has this conversation or this thought been a part of your growing up years? And what is your take on that, ma'am?
You had to distinguish two things. One is the personal relationship that my father definitely had to many of the Congress leaders. It was sort of ambiguous insofar. In a way, they were all comrades in arms. They were friends, if you would have it, brothers and sisters. And in that sense, they were all fighting for the same thing. Yet at the same time, my father was rather bitter that he did not get the support in his own efforts, because there was a competition essentially of means how to get independence. My father was of the opinion that it should not only be done by non-violent means, but particularly in the wake of an oncoming war, it should also be done by arms. And there was disagreement about that, but I think picking on that later on, there were people who sort of tried to really put a wedge between them. My father had his disagreements with Mahatma Gandhi, for example, but he always admired him greatly. He was the one who called him father of our nation. And I think later Mahatma Gandhi also realized that my father was a patriot of patriots, as he called him, and that in some ways he was equally engaged in fighting for India's independence. For example, prior to independence, Mahatma Gandhi was opposed to the partition of India. My father would have been opposed to that too. And sometimes I'm glad he did not live to see the terrible violence that took place in connection with the partition of the country. And later on, I think some of the sort of really secondary and minor figures in the Congress party sort of tried to also put a wedge between, say, for example, the Nehru family and my father. They had their differences, but ultimately they were the two secular leftist leaders in the Indian independence movement, and in that sense were also comrades in arms, so to say.
Very interesting that you brought about the entire character or the relationship, as you say, between Subhash Chandra Bose, Mahatma Gandhi, and Subhash Chandra Bose and the Nehru family. What would you tell us about the kind of bitterness that existed? You said some leaders later in the Congress party tried to draw a wedge between Netaji and the Nehru family. Who were they? Would you like to talk about it more? And do you feel that because of this, the kind of place that Netaji should have got in the history books of India maybe was denied to him?
there were some, I think, who believed that they sort of did a favor to the Nehru-Gandhi family by sort of downplaying my father's role.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was not the case, say, with Pandit Nehru or with Indira Gandhi, who had known each other. My father came to see the wife of Pandit Nehru when she was on her deathbed, so to say, but the younger Gandhis, of course, had no personal relationship to my father. They didn't know him. And I think some of their followers felt that by sort of downplaying Netaji, they were sort of upgrading them. I don't know whether this played any role for them, whether it was of any importance, but that certainly, I think, contributed to the fact that my father was sort of given a secondary role. On the other hand, there were always many people in the Congress party too who were admirers of my father, who did not participate in this sort of downgrading him. But I think one thing that always hurt me more than the fact that my father was not given his due, maybe, the Indian National Army was not treated very well in the beginning. For example, many of these soldiers were poor people. They had lived in the rubber plantations in Malaysia, then emigrated to India when India became independent. And they were really poor, and they were not even given recognition as a freedom fighter in the beginning. And for them, I think that was very disappointing. The soldiers were not recruited into the Indian army after independence, which was, I'm sure, a great disappointment for many of them. The British Indian army soldiers became the major part of the armed forces in free India. It may be practical not to put soldiers from two armies who had been fighting each other into the same army, but it certainly was a disappointment for the INA soldiers. So that always hurt me more, that in a way they sort of had to fend for themselves, and the educated, skilled people found their way, but many of the simple people really have virtually lived in poverty.
What you're saying is very significant, because you're saying that probably you felt that your father was given a secondary role in spite of the fact that he put everything for the freedom of this country. And what hurts you most is the fact that the INA, the Indian National Army that he had built, the people who had fought for India, they were not given their due. Now that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has actually awarded a lot of veterans from the INA today, four of them. How are you taking that? And does that kind of make you feel that INA is getting its due finally?
I think it is a gracious move. In a way, of course, it is a more symbolic gesture nowadays, because the veterans, I think for the most part, all of them have passed away. Even the youngest of them, for example, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, the Women's Corps, had some very young soldiers, 15, 16, 17 years old, but even they have passed away as far as I know, at least most of them. But still, it is very gratifying that they get a recognition, even if it may not mean anything materially anymore.
Yeah. Some of the slogans that Netaji gave, which were very popular in India, I know you're not very comfortable with Hindi, but tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga, and kadam kadam badhaye ja, khushi ke geet gaye ja, ye zindagi hai qaum ki, to qaum pe lutaye ja. Would you, do you actually say these lines or share it with other family members? And it'll be interesting to hear them from you.
I'm not a singer. I have a terrible voice for singing, and I can't keep a tune. But some of my relatives are very good singers, and as you may know, the Bengalis are very music and culture oriented. So many of my relatives who sing, well, they used to sing the old INA songs like Kadam Kadam Balarajam, and then of course there are other things like Jai Hind is a way of greeting which my father started in Germany actually 80 years ago. There was a German, in Germany there was an Indian Legion which had been set up with the idea maybe if there had been an overland attack on India by the Axis forces during the Second World War, then the Indian Legion would have been sent to fight. And the Indian Legion started the greeting Jai Hind. And of course, that is still the way the soldiers in the present Indian Army greet each other, which I think is nice, although maybe most of them don't know that it goes back to the Indian Legion, the INA and Netaji. And my father had also had the national anthem played for the first time as Indian anthem in Germany 80 years ago when the Indo-German Association was founded at that time. So I'm sure if he had known, he would have been very gratified that his choice of an anthem was picked up too later on.
Yeah. So Anita Bose Faf, Jai Hind, thank you very much. An absolute honor to have you join us on AajTak. Thank you so much.
Nice to have me on. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.